So we're picking up from where we left off last time. We got the forks completely disassembled and we're going to be replacing the steering head bearings. The bearings are notched, the grease is stiff and old, and it's what needs to be done. In order to get the bearing races out of the frame, unlike a lot of other bikes which have a way to get in behind and knock the bearing races out, that's just not possible on the BMW 2-valve twin. And really the only clean way to do it is with the Kuko puller. This is an expanding puller that goes in, grabs the bearing from underneath, and cleanly extracts the bearing. We offer this tool for sale. Also offer different attachments that screw on, for example, for swing arm bearings and other bearings that you might need to remove on motorcycles. So it's kind of pricey, but it's a great thing to have. It's something that lasts forever and have so many applications. So you need something exactly like this or something very similar to this. So let me show you how it works. I'm going to set this in like inside and turn down this nut here to grab just behind the bearing race. And then snug that down with a 22mm wrench. Don't have to tighten it too much. Now you sort of align this, and just to grab the outside edge of the frame so there's still enough clearance on both sides for the bearing to come through. So you have to sort of line that up. And now with a 32mm wrench, we're going to just tighten this big nut here. And you see the bearing coming out real nice. And there it is. And now we'll do the same exact thing on the lower bearing race. Okay, now we'll install the new bearing races. First thing I want to do is clean this very carefully and get all the old grease out. Just take some time and get that nice and clean in there. And in addition to just wiping it out, I'm going to use some brake parts cleaner, something to cut the grease so I can get those in there. The reason being, you want the bearings to seat nice and cleanly on the inside the frame, and so get rid of all the grime that's in there. I think that's good. Now, we sell the steering head bearings in a set of 2, really good quality bearings. All we need for right at the moment are the outer races. I'm just going to pull those out of the package, put the inner races aside. To install the new outer bearing races, you can use a standard bearing driver set. This is a 50mm bearing, fits quite nicely inside there, and you could just hammer it in with a hammer. I mean, that's one way to do it, but I'm going to show you what I think is a lot cleaner way to do it. So just gonna set that in there nice and evenly and just get it started. Important is that you don't want them to get cocked in there. So just sort of get it going. And the bottom one too. And now for this, you'll actually need 2 bearing drivers. Luckily these kits aren't that expensive, so you maybe have some extra ones, or you may have to get 2 kits. But if you take 2 of them and a piece of, this case it's 12mm threaded rod, or you could use 1/2 inch, then you can put one on each end and draw them together. It's puts them in a lot more cleanly and don't need to use a lot of force. So by doing it this way, I'm sure, or quite sure, that the bearings are nice and parallel and seated all the way. So the outer bearings are sorted, they're in clean, parallel, and now let's talk about how we're going to do those inner bearing races. The next thing we need to do is remove the lower bearings so that we could replace them, and there are a lot of different ways to do this actually. One way is to press the steering stem out. If you have a hydraulic press, you can set that in a press, you can push the stem out, that'll lift the bearing off, and then you press the stem back in again. That's one way. If you go that route, make sure that you mark the stem to the triple clamp so that you get it in the same position. This is important because of the steering lock that needs to be in a certain spot. Some people beat them off with chisels, whatever, but what I think is a pretty elegant solution for removing this without doing any damage at all. Let me show you how I do it. You chuck it in the vise. And these soft jaws are really cool because they help to center the part and hold it without marring the finish of the triple clamp. The first thing I'm going to do is cut off this cage. You can get in here with a pair of wire cutters or something like that and just cut that sheet metal. Just pry it apart so you can get all these rollers out. You can cut it in a couple of spots. And so a magnet's kind of a useful tool here to get those rollers out. Now we're just down to the inner race here. Take a Dremel tool with a very thin cutoff disc, and I'm just going to go in here and make a slice. Try not to damage the cup below, and I don't need to go in too far. Let me show you. I've switched to a more of a worn out cutting disc here so I can get in a little bit farther. So I've cut through a good portion of that bearing, and now on that spot I should be able to crack it with a sharp chisel. Lay that right in that slot that I just made and just give it a few wraps. Cool. So now I can see that I've cracked it all the way through right on that spot. Now that that's cracked, it's relieved the tension, and I can simply get underneath it on that lip. The bearing comes off with minimal effort. Just hit it on a couple different sides. Without first cracking the bearing, that wouldn't be anywhere near as easy. You can see here how that bearing cracked all the way through. Right there. And I was able to get the bearing off without damaging this little cup. So I can reuse this part. However, if you aren't so lucky, we do offer those in replacement in stainless steel. So that's an option you have if you damage the one you take off. Next thing we need to do is put the new bearing on without doing any damage. And there's a couple ways to do that as well. It's going to go like that with the tapered end up, and you can actually use the cracked bearing that you just took off upside down like that, and that will allow you to hammer the bearing on this wide surface, because when you put the bearing on, you want to make sure that you only hit on the inner race like that. So you would want to first grease the bearing up, and then you could use this as a tool, set it on there like so, and go around with a punch and drive it in place. That's a totally viable way to do it. Another kind of cool way is with this tool that I made here. And this is actually, you start with a piece of pipe. In this case, I used a fork tube, and then I machined out a plug for the end out of steel with just a slight interference fit, put it in with a press so it's a nice place to tap onto. And then I chamfered the edge so that it fits right inside and hits on just the upper race. Slides right over the top. Pretty good way to do it too. Well, it doesn't take much time to make something like this, and it's a tool you have forever, and it's a nice way to get the bearing on clean and flat. But first we got to grease them. We have to grease the bearings. So I've got a bearing packer here full of LM47 grease, which is the grease that I recommend. It's perfect for this application in the steering head because the steering head's not spinning, it's just rotating back and forth, and this is a great grease for use in this application by Liqui Moly. So you put if you have a bearing packer, you just kind of set the bearing in like so. With the bearing packer, it's really simple. You just put the bearing in there and press, and you see how that grease comes right through. It greases the inside of the bearing. You can see how that pushed the grease right through, and that bearing's fully packed. I'm just going to take a little bit on the outside also. And now this is ready to install. And now using my homemade tool here, set that right on there. First, I'm going to set it over on this part of the vise. Perfect. So another way we could have done that, if you don't have this tool or you don't feel like making one or whatever, is you could just simply use the bearing race that came out that we just cut earlier. Just put it on upside down like that, and I'm just going to demonstrate how that would have worked. Just get that sort of over there, and then take a punch. Fits perfectly on the bearing as well, and then you can just kind of go and tap around till you get that nice solid feel like that, and that does exactly the same thing. So that's a pretty good trick if you don't want to take the time to make the special tool. So I'm just going to take that back off of there, and here again, these soft jaws are awesome because you can clamp a tube like this. So that's another way to do the exact same thing. So now that's ready to install. Now we just need to also grease the upper bearing. On this bearing we use the bearing packer, but there's another way you can do it if you don't have a bearing packer. I'll show you how that could be done. Grab a good amount of grease in the palm of your hand, and then you simply take the bearing and push it in until you see the grease coming through the top. So yeah, this works just as well as a bearing packer, just takes a little bit more time. No big deal. Both bearings are greased, the lower bearings installed, and we're going to have a look at the forks and then come circle around back to install this together with the forks in just a moment. So I'm going to set those parts aside and grab one of the fork legs here. Before we work on the fork tubes, I just want to check to make sure that they're straight and check the general conditions. So for that, I've just got a couple of V-blocks here and set the tube in like that with the dial indicator. And now rotate that. Now spec is up to 1/10 is actually permissible. This one looks like it has like 0.02 of a millimeter run out, so that one's fine. You can see the wear we were talking about earlier, and the reason why we put these index marks on so they go back to the same spot. You can actually see the scoring, but it's really mostly a visual thing. They're still going to work okay, but that's why it's important they go back in the same way they came out. If the tube is out of spec in terms of run out, or if this wear is, in your opinion, too much, or even if you get some rust pitting or whatever like that, we try to always keep in stock these really nice European-made replica fork tubes. They're really high quality and just a direct replacement for the originals. All right, let me check out the other one too. About the same, maybe a little bit more, but it's still within spec. We're going to run them. You could do this work on the bike too, just as easily, but it's a little easier to show you, and it's actually a little easier to work with on the workbench. So I've got them checked up in a soft drawed vise plates, and great way to work on these parts. Now we offer these complete seal kits, which comes with all the seals that you need, the damping rings, everything like that. We have different versions available for different years. This is the one for this bike. And so let's go ahead and start by taking this apart and have a look at the various parts inside. You're going to need a set of snap ring pliers to remove the snap ring that you'll find in the end of the fork tube, like so. And then you push the damping rod in. You see these two little cutouts here. You can also use snap ring pliers to get in there and break that little nut free. It just spins out. Once it comes free, you can usually just kind of spin it out. Just like that. Then there's a spacer, like so. And then there's another one of those rings in here. Loosen that, and then usually you can just spin that out too. That's how those come apart. Now we remove the damping rod. So the first thing we're going to do here is change out these damping rings. These are just like piston rings. They just sort of come off one at a time like that. And the new kit comes with 6 new rings. Just like on a piston, you want to sort of stagger the gaps at 30 degrees roughly. This bumper goes on like so. Now there's also some springs here that you want to just check for free action. There's also a spring in here with a ball. You could take it apart and have a look, but chances are it's probably in pretty good shape. And then the crush ring on the end needs to come off. Just sort of separate that with a razor. Now you notice usually that the ring that comes off is the old style fiber-filled ring, and that's exactly what we provide in the kit too, just like original. So it's going to go on there. We'll do that a little bit later so you don't lose it, but that's included in the kit as well. There's a special tool available from BMW for installing these. You can see it's sort of cone shaped on the inside, it's threaded, it just screws into the end of the fork till it bottoms, and that enables you to slide the damping rod in. But there's another way you can do that too if you don't have this tool. So then I measure the inside here. I see that the threaded portion is approximately 31 millimeters in diameter, and the inside of the fork tube is approximately 28 millimeters in diameter, so there's a difference of 3 millimeters. So we need to have something that's about 1.5 millimeters thick. And so I came up with this. It's just a piece of plastic, actually from a binder. And I cut off a full length of it. And when I roll it up to approximately that diameter and measure it, I get about 1.3 millimeters thickness. So we're pretty close. So now what I'm going to try and do is just put this, using this piece of plastic here, and roll it up around. And we'll try to stick that in there till it bottoms out on that sharp edge. Kind of hold it all in alignment, and then we'll just give it a little bit of wiggling and get it past that sharp edge. That worked great. So that's a good workaround for that. Next thing is this little bumper. These were actually missing entirely in these forks. They probably were all disintegrated and never replaced, but these are there so that when the fork goes to full extension, it's not metal on metal. So that goes in next. Cool, now we're just gonna put these rings back in the same way that they came out. Okay, you don't need to tighten these up super tight, just have to be snug. And then put the clip back in. Now, you can reuse this clip. There's nothing wrong with that. But keep in mind that these sorts of things are directional. These are made on a kind of a punch sort of machine. And you find your one end is always a little bit rounded. One end's a little bit sharp. You want the sharp edge out, which is where the way a snap ring should be installed always. So we'll set that in the groove. That's that. And now we'll do the same with the other one. Now we're going to have a look at the fork sliders, change out the fork seal and the bottom plug seal and bumper. So we'll start with the fork seal. You chuck that up. And then very carefully grab a hold of the seal and pry it out. You want to make sure you don't go in too deep so that you put a score in there. Just like that. When you put the new fork seal in, you want to make sure that you don't mush down this top lip here. The factory tool actually has a little bit of a recess right there, so the lip fits in there and it's protected. This works really well. If you don't have access to something like this, or you don't have the ability to make something like this, then you want to choose a socket or some sort of ring that basically straddles around the outer edge so that you don't mash that top lip down, so you don't have a leak as a result. So that's what you would need to do. However, since I happen to have the right driver, I'm going to go ahead and use that. in this case. Put a little bit of grease on the inside of the seal. I'm using actually wheel bearing grease in this case. And slide that on. And then I'm going to put that on a piece of wood to sort of protect the part and just drive that seal in. That's that. Now the bottom cup. Now with the fork slider clamped into the soft jaws 36mm socket, the main reason for taking this apart at all is to replace this bumper on the bottom. These sometimes get kind of mushed out there, included in the new seal kit. And then of course to have the opportunity to clean everything out really nicely while you have it apart. Now you got to get the old seal ring off of here. Just get a little screwdriver in there and pry that out. And then these new fiber-filled crush washers are also included in the kit. I put the seam up. That's the way I do it. The solid side, the closed side against the nut. And then this bumper fits in there first like so. Push that in. This is for when the suspension goes full compression, that it'll bump on the bottom here. And torque to spec, 80 to 100 Newton meters is what's suggested. Okay, that one's ready to rock. Now we'll do the next one. I'm going to put the lower triple clamp back in, get the steering head going back together again, and that just, everything's all greased, we're all good to go here. And because I only have two hands, having a little strap like this is real handy. You can just loop that around and tighten it up to hold the lower clamp in place while you work on the top bearing. Fits in there like that. It's going to have to be tapped in place because it's a bit of an interference fit. So what you can do is just carefully, without mashing the outside of the bearing, go on the inside of the bearing and just work it in place like that. And of course, if you have a cool driver like I made, that works too. Just slip that on there. And that's also good for this job. There we go. Now the next thing is we just put this cap back on here. And if this is another thing that we also do carry too, if yours is a little rusty or not looking too good anymore, the replacement part. And then this nut goes on with the chamfer side facing down. If it doesn't spin on by hand easily, you'll use this hook wrench. And that happens to be the case here. It's not that it's really messed up or anything, just a little bit tight. So now we've come to a really good stopping point. We've got the steering head bearings in, the lower clamp installed and bolted in. So now the next thing is going to be to continue reassembling the front end and going through each component as we do so. So that'll be next time around. Make sure that you subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and leave us comments, which we'll answer as soon as we can. And you'll also find links in the bottom here of the YouTube channel to a lot of the parts that we're using in this video. So I hope this has been helpful for you, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.